Okay, everybody, this is Sheets, and we're going to be doing week 3 of Survivor. Had a good week last week, as did pretty much everybody, but we got through with kind of a combination of a little chalk and a little bit of aggressiveness. We talked about Tennessee and Tampa being the conservative plays, and we talked about Arizona and Chicago and Cleveland being the aggressive plays, and everybody won. So what does that mean? It means that the people that played the more aggressive plays actually did, in a sense, pick up a little bit of EV, because those less popular teams are going to lead you to kind of unique constructions down the road, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So let's again review. Again, we're going to do this every week. What's important when it comes to picking Survivor picks, all right? There are, again, 2 components. One is immediate EV, and 2 is future value. And part of the future value piece, it deals with mapping, which involves kind of planning out your strategy throughout the course of the season well in advance. Because again, you don't just pick the team that's going to get you through that week. You pick a path that is going to hopefully put you in the best position to win the whole thing. And the other thing to remember is that when you're dealing with immediate EV, there are 2 components to that. One is winning chances, and you don't want to replace your biases over the Vegas win odds that much. Now again, that's not to say that the win odds that Vegas predicts are exactly what the win odds are, but they're usually a decent, at least, representation of it. So you don't want to, if a team is 80% to win, you should presume they're pretty close to that. You shouldn't say, well, both these teams look like 80% to win, but this team I'll never play because I just don't like this quarterback, or I don't like this or that, or it's a division game. You want to remove your biases from that component of it. So again, immediate EV is a combination of winning chances plus and popularity. Because if you have 2 teams with equal winning chances, but everybody's taking one of them, you're going to get incredible leverage by taking the other. And for example, like this week is a good example of that. It's a pretty severe example of that. So you see, like Indianapolis, if you rank this by just winning percentage, Indianapolis is going to have the highest winning percentage of anybody by a really decent amount. But the thing is that according to the recent runs, which average the major pools, over 40% of the people are picking them. So what that does is when you rank this by EV, even though Indianapolis is the biggest win odds by a decent amount, from an EV perspective, they're actually only the 4th, 5th, maybe the 10th best team on the board, or 8th best team on the board. So that's why immediate EV is important opposed to just winning chances, because it also factors in the popularity of it. Like, for example, Cleveland, you'll see, has, second best winning chances, but only 6% of the people are picking them. So that's why their EV is so high. So just on a raw basis, without even looking at future value and mapping and stuff, I mean, there's kind of a standout play here if you presume that all these numbers are accurate with the popularity numbers. Now, as you get closer to the end of your pools, and if you're in a smaller pool, you can start to replace your own popularity numbers, and you'll know who people are picking. And then if you want, you can create, and maybe I'll help you guys do this, your own immediate EV calculator for your own particular pool. But this kind of like assumes the popularity from just all the major pools, because that's usually most people play with these big pools anyway. So you see, Cleveland is clearly the highest EV play, by 0.05. So they're like 1.1. And what's more is that their future value is very slim. So this is a perfect example of a good play, you know what I mean, in Survivor, is you take a team with the highest EV and really low future value. And this is just kind of perfect. Now, likewise, you look down at this next group, New England and KC, you know, they have the next best EV, and their future value is not that much either. You know what I mean? It's not as low as Cleveland, but it's somewhat low. So these rates would be good plays also. Now, when you get to Seattle and Tampa, they are weaker than New England and LAC with respect to EV, and also they have higher future value. So Seattle and Tampa are the teams that you're really going to want to avoid. In addition to that, as I mentioned, where is Indianapolis anyway? Indianapolis is a team you're going to want to avoid because their EV is just really, really low. Their future value is low too. So they're not much. So this is the thing. They're probably similar to Philly and Arizona, right? Actually, Philly and Arizona are probably a little bit better because they have a higher EV than Indianapolis, and they have a little bit lower future value. Now, again, this is very primitive estimates of future value. So you don't want to take this 100% to the bank. You can use your own kind of assessment of where you're going to use these teams to really assess future value. And remember, as I mentioned earlier, with COVID, and not only with COVID, the future value component of it is always the one with the most variance because, you know, think about it, the further into the future you have to project, the more variance there is. Where now you just kind of know what the popularity is, you kind of know what the win odds for this week are going to be. So let's remind us a couple of the interesting mapping situations. And so we did this the last couple of weeks as we kind of highlighted week 5 as a good example of it, of where you're going to be able to kind of, you know, differentiate and just kind of, you know, I don't know if you guys ever watched Moneyball, but there was a great scene where the Peter character was talking to David Justice in the Boston. David Justice saying, "How come you charge money for soda?" And Peter said, "Well, you know, Billy likes to keep the money on the field, and you know, keep the savings on the field." And Justice says, "Where on the field is my dollar for a soda?" And he says, "It's hard to see, but it's out there." And that's kind of the way it is with Survivor. Sometimes you make a pick, and whether it wins or if it wins or if it doesn't win or whatever, you pick up extra value without actually being able to see it. And like, here's a good example. So you go to week 5, and we talked about this several times. So week 5, you're going to have you're going to have a whole bunch of big favorites, right? Baltimore, San Francisco, Kansas City, Dallas, New Orleans, whatever. But they're not all created equal because you look ahead to, say, week 14. Is that the example that I used? Week 14 was an example, but actually 15 was one example. So week 15, if you go all the way out to there, and yes, you do need to plan out like this, Baltimore is going to have a 5-point edge over the next team, which is a really, really big edge, okay? So you want to kind of save them for that. I'm going to pause for a second. Sorry, so what I was going to say is that, so Baltimore, again, being a 5-point edge over the next team, you know, you might not want to use them in 5. Yet on the other hand, again, we talked about this, Baltimore also, you know, they might be a 5-point edge over everybody else in week 5 too, right? Which is kind of interesting. So maybe it's not as big of a deal to fade Baltimore in 5 as I thought. But we'll look into that, because what I was going to get to is when you go reach down for these other teams in week 5. So San Francisco would be another team to look at, but if you noticed, where were they? San Francisco was going to rate to be a pretty big favorite. Was it in 14 maybe? So San Francisco would be a big favorite in 14. But even still, you see what happens when you try to map these numbers that you kind of play with in the future. They kind of adjust. So like here in week 13, you see Denver being a 3-point edge over the next team. So you probably want to save them for 13. So you don't want to probably use them as a good option in week 5 also. And that's the way you kind of have to think about things. So let's okay, so here was another example. So Tampa this week. I mentioned they were just kind of an okay play, probably not the greatest. And one of the reasons why was because they were a pretty decent option in week 8. Like if you wanted to, not play Kansas City, for example, Tampa Bay looked to be a decent option in week 8. So you might not want to burn them now. So that's the way you think about these types of things. But again, cutting to the quick, who I think the good plays are this week. Again, I think Cleveland is clearly the best. And, if I had one entry, that's who I would use. And if I were going to spread, the next two that I would use would be New England and the Chargers. And then if you wanted to really get aggressive, you want to come down to Philly and Arizona maybe. Now, if you're playing, if you're playing pools where you're going to have to do double picks later, then future value becomes even much more important. So you really want to weight teams like Philly and Arizona even more than Seattle, Tampa, because you're really going to need those Seattle, Tampas later on. All right, so that's it. Once again, to reiterate, Cleveland, top pick. New England, LAC would be the next two by, for me, pretty decent amount. And that should do it for this week's Survivor.